Okay, well, it's good to be back here again for another Wednesday discussion. And today's topic is about this term we hear a lot, which is institutional control. And it usually comes up in a negative way, like someone's lost it. A loss of institutional control with regard to athletics. We've heard about that historically. And it never seems to come up in a positive fashion. It's always like what someone did wrong or didn't know what was going on. And so I think that bears a little bit of discussion. These sessions we've been having on Wednesdays, we've been focusing on like how do we grow good from athletics? Like what are the good things that come out of it? And kind of some of the easy parts of those conversations are kind of the personal attributes, the things we learn in athletics. We learn how to work hard, we learn how to become disciplined, how to be a teammate, all of these things. But we're also trying to dig a little bit into some of the nuance of the good that can come from athletics. And at a college level, some of that ends up being things like governance and oversight, and the term control is an interesting one I'd like to talk about itself as well. Like, do we actually have control? So I think it's a conversation that is not one that is the first we often think about when it comes to growing good governance, but it is an important one, especially on campuses, and it's one that we're hearing a lot about recently. The NCAA is not new. I wrote down, did a little history research here recently, and so the first college kind of athletic contest was Harvard-Yale rowing competition in 1852. So that's pre-Civil War that college athletics started. At that time, and like for the first 50 years of college athletics, there wasn't like this kind of central national body that governed the competition. It was, at that time, it was kind of like there was an American Rowing Association that just looked at rowing and tried to make it somewhat fair in the competition and tried to make it somewhat attached to what those colleges were about, so you couldn't just bring in anyone, although it was very, very loose. And then football started getting popular, American football, and then basketball toward soon after the sport was invented. And even in those sports, some of the biggest kind of issues in the early days were, like football was played differently in different parts of the country. The rules themselves were kind of different. So every time like some teams would come together, the first thing they had to do was agree upon the rules that they would follow in the game. So some of the initial oversight then was relating to just that, like how do we know that we're playing the same game, whether it's rowing or football or basketball. Football caused some change. Some people think football kind of brought about this kind of national need for a national body, and that people started dying and being very, very dangerous in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s. So Theodore Roosevelt was president, and he was a big sports fan. He actually loved football, loved exercise and activity, and so he brought these groups to the White House on two different occasions to talk about like how can we think about football, how can we make it safe. And then kind of from those initial meetings were these kind of the initial stages of the NCAA and of kind of a need for looking at not just rules but also kind of safety and about making sure that these things are actually they're attached to the colleges. They're not just these freestanding things. So that was kind of this initial kind of important thing, and there have been lots of changes over the years, obviously, that we know about, that we can talk about a little bit. But especially in these last months, as we're filming this, we are hearing more and more and more about the NCAA and this term governance, these terms control. Right now, it's coming up a lot in these timely issues of like pay for play and who should get paid and who should not, and if someone were to get paid more, how would it happen? It's a very technical conversation in some ways right now. But I wanted to step back a little bit and think about this idea of governance at the national level. And sometimes Katie, who's here to join us, is the oversees compliance on our campus. Sometimes governance and compliance, I think those terms kind of they intersect, and people don't think of them differently or don't know how they relate. Katie, in your role, you've done this for a number of years, and you've kind of progressively gotten really active both here at our campus but also nationally at the conference level. How have you seen kind of this this is a kind of a broad question, but this idea of compliance, and how do you what does that mean to you, the term compliance, and how does it fit into this idea of oversight, like at a national level?
I think that you were saying before how it's so important for athletic departments. One of the core values is that it's part of the university. And so when there's a rule like institutional control that requires oversight by the institution of its athletics department, that's ensuring that it remains part of the university's core values and has integrity and is trying to do what's right. And so it really starts with the chancellor, who likely delegates it to the athletic director, just like here, and then to all of us to try to make sure that we're complying with all the rules and doing things the right way. So we're based on three main concepts of education, trying to inform people as best we can about what the rules are, and we're not going to be able to tell them every single rule because there's so many. But if nothing else, giving our constituents, both internally and externally, the idea about what to ask questions about. And so even if you don't know the rule or don't know the answer, at least a red flag goes off in your head to say, you know what, I better give the compliance office a call or give somebody a call to make sure that this is working right. With education comes monitoring systems. That's the only way to really check if your education's effective, is if you have monitoring systems in place to make sure people are following the rules. And then, of course, with as many rules as they are, we're going to have self-reporting, and it's okay to self-report. There's just too many rules not to have violations. The key is that they're inadvertent. And so that's what institutional control is meant to try to address, is having transparency on what types of violations are going on or what the culture of the program is, to make sure that it's not something more serious. And I mentioned the word culture, and I think that is the key to institutional control, is that there is a culture of compliance that's established that takes a long time to get there, but once you get there, it feels like you're getting asked a lot more questions than you ever have before, and people recognize it. Maybe in a negative way, but also in a positive way, because as we always tell people when we educate them, that we just don't want to jeopardize the eligibility of our student athletes and our prospective student athletes. That's at the forefront of all of this, is student athlete welfare. So making sure that we're doing the things we need to be doing and doing it right.
Katie, so the first thing, the education component, that, can you talk about who and how? Who do you have to educate,
Right.
and then how do you go about it?
Right. Well, the NCAA rules on institutional control say we're responsible for coaches, student athletes, prospective student athletes, staff, as well as all of our boosters and fans. So it's a broad range of individuals that are not just locally. You're responsible to monitor, to educate folks that have any sort of ties to UW, if it's alums, if they've ever donated money to UW athletics, or been otherwise, there's this all-inclusive category that says you've otherwise been involved in promoting UW athletics. Well, that's a pretty broad definition of a representative athletics interests, or best known as a booster. So it's a large responsibility to try to get as much information as possible in their hands.
And the development of a culture, does that come from these three things of education, monitoring, reporting, or is it a deeper thing? What have been, I think that now I get a sense that there's a good culture of compliance here. It's always something that's being worked on. What are the indicators of a culture of compliance?
I think the biggest difference maker in a culture of compliance is what the athletic director's tone is with staff on how important it is to follow rules and not be afraid to self-report, not be afraid to ask questions, supported by the campus as well, that it's an important factor. So I always joke around, somebody might say, when you go to interview, a staff member, what is compliance? Oh, well, it's Katie, Joel, Melissa, Brady going down the list versus no, compliance is really a shared responsibility amongst all of us. And so when our development staff are out at events, I will get calls from them to say, hey, this representative asked if they could do this. Is it okay or not? To me, that's a demonstration of a culture in that red flag came up to the development staff and they're going to ask to make sure that we're, and that could be ticket office, that could be guest services, that could be men's basketball operations, going down the list.
Yeah. There was this time about, I guess, almost 30 years ago, the Knight Commission, where in the years leading up to that, there had been all these kind of football scandals and things at SMU and these other places where just like, I think that the stats for in the 1980s were that like half of major football programs were on like sanctions. That may be a little bit off on the exact number, but it was a huge proportion of programs were kind of from the ultimate penalty we saw at SMU to just lots of stuff happening, lots of kind of black eyes being given to universities for what was going on. So the Knight Commission came, met, and it's a long kind of drawn out process, but still happening today.
Absolutely. But
their initial reports, they did three years in a row where the Knight Commission had these reports. And one of the main things that came out of that was this term, presidential control. Is that term something that's still, you started with that, with the president or chancellor. Is that something that comes into play on a regular basis in your work or in the department's work, or what does that even really mean in the day-to-day, presidential control?
Well, I think oftentimes it may be funneled through different measures. So for example, in terms of the transparency on self-reporting, that we report out to the athletic board, academics, and compliance committee of all the self-reports that we have. And so we consider that to be the arm of campus that we're transparent with, that the chancellor would delegate to say, hey, this is what I want you to pay attention to, basically as a purpose of the committee to monitor those types of things. And then just having a working relationship and even from a dotted line to legal services, to the faculty rep. So it's demonstrated we do have direct communication with the chancellor's office, but on a daily basis, it's probably even more so because of the channels that she's established for us to get information to her office.
Yeah. I think some of us who are so much in doing this work now maybe don't have familiarity or understanding of the context that from which this is all coming. You referred to, we have an athletic board on campus, so that's part of the governance infrastructure of faculty governance, faculty senate, to kind of make sure that athletics is not kind of this thing off on the side from everything else. So the athletic board is part of that. The chancellor certainly you regularly meet with other chancellors, both at the conference level and national level. But even at kind of a broader campus level, it's not just like athletics meeting with the faculty rep. There's a broader kind of campus investment in governance and oversight. And luckily, Andrew is here today. Andrew Norman from the Office of Legal Affairs, and Andrew's one of the main people involved in that at our campus now. So Andrew works in the Office of Legal Affairs in Bascom Hill, but is very much integrated into these issues of kind of governance, presidential control, and those things on our campus. There are a lot of examples of how that plays out. Maybe I could ask you a two-part question, Andrew. One is like, how does, for example, legal affairs fit into kind of this discussion of presidential control? And then there's this one specific kind of thing that's happened in the last several years called this institutional standards that the Big Ten Conference has started kind of utilizing. Can you maybe explain what that is as well?
Sure.
So a bigger picture of how you fit into the picture of oversight, and then this one example of this kind of relatively recent development and how that plays out.
Sure. I think the first question is sort of how our office helps with the oversight. Is I think that we at least attempt to try to facilitate the accurate use of shared governance with athletics. We don't tell athletics, how to do what they're doing, but we do make sure, we attempt to make sure, help athletics sort of comply with the broader university setting, comply with the requirements of shared governance, comply with, all sorts of different areas, hiring people, things like that, or, discipline, things like that. So we would be able to provide, guidance there, but we're not really part of the governance aspect of this, right? It's the chancellor, down to the athletic director, and then sort of, the chancellor also receives input and recommendations from the athletic board, as you said, as part of the shared governance requirements, and that's part of our state law, is that they are part of the decision-making process for the university. So I think for good reason, and we don't have a decision sort of maker position on this, but we try to help facilitate that in line with the remaining.
But that's an important role, because there's a lot of gray area. Like there are a lot of kind of, you mentioned like hiring people. There's some things about maybe operating in an athletic environment where maybe if you have to hire a new coach in a sport, there's maybe a timeliness to it that might be different from hiring a professor on a campus. So there ends up being a fair amount of gray area. Is that where some of that interpretation comes
Sure.
in?
I mean, there's still some basic requirements that come into play, even in the most high-profile hirings. I think that, on the ground, we have to treat them a little bit differently than any sort of open position for the remainder of campus, but there are still posting requirements, there are still competition requirements, there are still things like that, just as a result of state law.
This, can you talk a little bit about this institutional document, what it is, how it came about?
Sure, and I think it sort of fits together with that idea. There's a lot of NCAA rules, and I'm not the expert on the NCAA rules here, but despite the fact that there's so many, they don't necessarily hit some of the worst things that have happened in athletics recently, right? So you think about, the first one that comes to mind for a lot of people is Penn State. I don't think that's squarely sort of in any set of NCAA's rules, because it wasn't something that was contemplated by the people that were trying to manage these athletic departments. So as groups tend to do, we want to have some sort of reaction to prevent that from happening again. And the idea was, well, I think there was a decision made, what happened at Penn State, how did that happen? I think the conclusion was that there was improper influence placed on the various aspects of campus by a coach, by a coaching staff, by a sport. That sort of took out the safeguards that are otherwise in a university setting to prevent these terrible things from happening. And I think if you look around and you say, well, what does the NCAA have to tell us that we need that? I don't think it was terribly clear that we all had sort of a shared set of policies and rules that really made it clear what was appropriate influence, what was inappropriate influence, and where the athletic department was maybe able to live outside of the university for some purposes versus inside the university. So the presidents and chancellors of the Big Ten took a long time actually in coming together, and I know that our athletic department was pretty central to drafting these things, and I know at one point they were a little bit more draconian, and it was like this idea that the Big Ten could come in and review you in all these areas and cite you, and then because it was all very concerning at the time. I think through the process they've softened a little bit to be passed, but it's this idea that you have to have standards if you're a Big Ten institution that subjects sort of your student athletes and your other people to the same basic standards of the university. And a good example of this would be, let's see, what would be a really good example? Student discipline and codes of conduct. You have to be in the Big Ten, you have to have a policy that's written and followed that your student athletes are subject to the same discipline and code of conduct as any other student athlete on campus. You can't pull them out of that and say they're athletics, they're special. Same with admissions. They have to go through the same admissions process as everybody else on the campus. And what these rules are trying to do is both, guarantee that they're subject to all those rules and to prevent coaches mainly, and I think this is one of the limitations of this document, it was very coach focused at the time, aren't in there inappropriately influencing things like that. So there's 5 areas. Rules compliance, so every year we talk to compliance when we decide whether we're complying with these standards, and say, Katie, do you know of any coach that came in and said, hey, you gotta clear this guy, or she has to play next week. Admissions, we already talked about, you can have input in the admissions process, but it has to be appropriate. You can recognize a student athlete's special skill, but you can't just say, this person plays volleyball, she gets in. Let's see, what's the other one? Academic support. So, if we can't have coaches contacting professors, we can't have, classes which are specifically designed to get credits to a certain team that aren't, a real academic class, that kind of thing. And so we talked to the academics folks to find out if anybody's had any issues with that. I should put my finger here so I don't lose it next time. Admission, we talked about student discipline and codes of conduct, and then, so this is, I think this is interesting. Then there's two more right at the end, and you can kind of sort of track the issues that the Big Ten was interested in at the time. All of a sudden, we got a lot of sort of focus on medical and athletic training services, and the original idea was we got to make sure that coaches aren't pressuring our physicians and trainers into getting somebody back on the field, clearing concussions and things like that. That's kind of morphed because, we've all, there's been another big terrible thing that's happened in the world of athletics related to training services into how do you sort of prevent that inappropriate behavior that occurred at Michigan State. And then the last one that was added actually during this process was cost of attendance. That was a direct result of the court case that ruled that we can now start paying cost of attendance. There was concern that coaches were going to go to the campus offices and argue that cost of attendance, the federally mandated calculation of the amounts you can give for federal loans, be erased so that they could compete for recruits by saying we have the highest cost of attendance in the conference, right? So these things kind of develop, and the whole idea is, it has to be your athletic department and your teams have to be part of the university, have to be subject to the same rules and standards. But again, it's also a good example of sort of, kind of reacting to bad things that have happened.
So each year, someone in each of those areas has to sign off and say things are going the right way here.
Yeah.
What if someone in like the financial aid office said, no, actually, someone
Sure.
came to me and said, let's raise this. What are the implications of that?
So every year, I'll just take one step back and then I'll answer your question if that's okay. Every year we have to submit a report to the Big Ten talking about our compliance with our standards. And we were kind of left to our own, each campus to figure out how they were going to do that. What I came up with was I have a conversation, or at least an email, because we've done this for years in a row now, with Katie and with Doug Teat, who is the Senior Associate Athletic Director of Student Services, and then our registrar, our Director of Admissions, somebody from the Dean of Students, our sports medicine sort of head trainer, sort of kind of oversight guy, the head team physician, and the Director of Financial Aid. And I have each of them sign a statement along the lines of, here are what I understand the obligations of the department are under the standards. No, nobody's inappropriately influenced me in these areas, and they sign it. And then I take all of those documents and I give them to you, and I give them to the athletic director, and I give them to the chancellor, and hopefully that's enough to convince you to sign the main document that says we believe we're in compliance with the standards. Nobody outside of the department has ever yet told me, no, this was a problem. We had a coach come and say, this kid's got to play tomorrow, right? Let's talk about this grade, or anything like that. The department itself has caught a few situations where the inappropriate person from the athletic department has maybe contacted a professor and said, our flight's delayed. Can the student athlete make up the test tomorrow or something like that? And those communications shouldn't be happening through anybody related to the team. It should be happening through Doug's office, basically. So in those situations where we've had some very small non-compliance, we write up sort of a potential violation of the standards, and we say, here's what happened. We've done extra training. We've told them not to do this again. We don't think that this is sort of a sign of some terrible systematic failure. We'll do better next time.
So I remembered you saying this, Katie, years ago, and probably have repeated it, which is that, it's concerning if you have if you were to come as a compliance department every year, say 0, we didn't do anything wrong, like that might be an indicator of like not looking. But so this is a step up of, it's not saying that nothing
No.
has ever happened in any of these areas. It's
Right.
saying that the infrastructure is in place. There's not kind of this kind of, it's different from that coach who happens to make a phone call that she didn't know she could make.
Right.
She was trying to honestly help a
Right.
student do well versus someone trying to change a university policy on something.
Sure. So yeah, exactly. So a report of noncompliance that Katie makes doesn't cause us to have to report under this.
Okay.
Now, if somebody tried to talk Katie out of making a report of noncompliance, that could be involved here.
Mhm.
Sort of similarly, the fact that somebody gets a concussion is not a breach of this protocol. But if somebody pressured somebody to come back to play or somebody to get cleared as a result of, when somebody had a concussion, that would be a violation of this. And to your point, yes, if you never report sort of any violations, you have to question sort of how hard are you looking. It's interesting though, because I think we are the only school who's ever reported a violation of these standards.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Huh. Well, so I mean, like, maybe that leads me to, first of all.
But I don't think, again, to your point, I don't think
Yeah.
it's a bad sign. I
Yeah.
just think some places are taking this
No,
more
I think
seriously
it's a good, I think
than
it's a
other
good
places.
sign along the lines of what.
Being
uh,
transparent.
Being transparent. So that means that brings the question to me of, are these of, what do you see as their utility? If,
Sure.
I mean, is there teeth on this, or is it, what's your thoughts about it?
I think they have whatever utility your university is interested in giving them. I think our process, which requires people to sit down and think about whether they've had any issues and sign a document that's eventually going to be shown to the chancellor, at least here, gives it value, right? And I think that giving people the opportunity in these areas, the person who's the head of admissions, every year, a person has the ability to talk to me and say, this is troubling to me, and just even that opportunity, I think, has value. If it's not something that you're, aggressively looking into, the Big Ten is not going to really take action, at least we haven't seen that. So as far as conference-wide, I don't know, what do you think, Katie? Do you think this has had
Well-
big effects on the conference?
I don't know about conference-wide, but I will say I refer to the document
Yeah.
a lot, especially as we get new staff or coaches that transition into positions and maybe something looked differently at their prior institution, and this really should be followed whether or not it was written down or not. It helps to be able to refer back to this document and say, look, the Big Ten's enacted this institutional control standards, which helps give us some credibility as to what we're saying. Look, Coach, we're trying to protect you. So I know your intentions are good in wanting to bridge, have relationships with people on campus and bridge the divide between athletics and campus that may sometimes exist. But Coach, we're trying to protect you here. And so let's make sure that we do it this way instead of this way. So we're not saying, no, don't be friendly and, invite campus into our athletic department, but more about how you do it. And so to avoid any sort of, like the small violations we've had of somebody maybe mistaking, oh, well, I was already, in contact with this professor because they meet with our recruits on visits, and I just thought, well, our student's gonna be late for the exam, so I'm just gonna send him an email, which is completely, inadvertent that it would violate the rule. But I think it does help at least give some sort of backing to what we're trying to say, even though these are really developed to deal with extreme circumstances. I know another, school highly publicized where a coach went to a professor in disguise to try to change the grade of a student athlete, and that coach has, not been at that school.
And you're not gonna tell us the name of the school, are you?
Well, it was public. So,
After.
I don't like to speak about,
Yeah.
other school. I just give examples though that I think are really important to demonstrate, not so much the name of the school, but practical examples that happen that, I think this policy was meant to address that are not the other issues, or daily interactions we have with coaches.
And I will say too that the Big Ten basically put out a template, and these are all the things that your policy needs to establish. We wrote our policy. We didn't have to change any of our structure, right? So like just as an example, right? One of the things in our standards is that in order to ensure that athletic academic support staff members are free from potential improper influence, coaches shall not have direct responsibility for or exercise undue improper influence over the hiring or supervision of any member of the academic support staff. So ours don't, right? We don't, the academic support staff doesn't work for football, it works for academic services, so we didn't have to change that. Other universities, not specifically that one, but other universities, I think, in order to just immediately comply with the requirements of the standards, maybe did have to change some things. So there is value to that. I want to be clear. I mean, the actual bringing them in and having everybody have a sort of a shared baseline set of expectations is very good. I guess I have less feelings about the yearly report.
Yeah. Well, the thing you said about it does force you to sit down with different people and talk about it, and it presents an opportunity for someone to say, hey,
The way we
take
do
a look
it.
at this. Yeah, the way we do it.
Yeah.
And so that's not a small thing on this campus, you know, and a lot of our, like Big Ten, if you think about how big these campuses are and how busy everyone is and how different our work is, to have, like, there almost has to be a reason to come together to talk about things.
Right.
And this is doing so in a little bit more of a proactive way than always after a problem occurs. So I mean, I see utility as a process of getting people to talk about things who might not otherwise talk about it. If you were to change it, is there anything you would do to change it?
Yeah, I would make it less coach specific. You know, I have always have concerns that we're just trying to solve the last problem as opposed to, you know, preventing the next problem. And this really was solving the last problem, kind of. You know, if Katie Smith goes to admissions and has undue influence on something, or if, you know, Barry Alvarez goes and talks to a professor, that's technically not
Oh, right.
in here because they're not coaches.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying the whole document's limited to coaches, but a lot of the really specific things are coach related because of the idea that a coach in a certain situation had too much influence.
Mhm.
I would, you know, not to take on more obligations, but I think it should probably be more broadly applied to certain athletic department staff, non-athletic department staff. I mean, you know, all sorts of people have an interest in certain sports at some times, but, you know, make sure that the decision makers are allowed to be making a decision regardless of who's maybe inappropriately influencing them.
There's so many people, like, so you say coaches, there's so many people on a campus.
Sure.
And then
Even off the
we're
campus,
not,
boosters.
as I was gonna say, we're not even talking about boosters or fans or this idea of control. I want to come back to that for a second. Is one that, man, that's tough. That's tough to talk about control when there's that many people involved and that breadth of an enterprise. In the little article that goes along with this, I shared this one example of, this is like 25 or 30 years ago when I was in college and playing basketball. I was in this game, and it was, my school was playing against Indiana University, and we were in the middle of this game, and their coach was Bob Knight, the famous coach, and I just can picture this right in my head. I was right there, I was playing the game, and he's a very imposing presence. And we were coming like out of a timeout or something, and his son was playing for the team at the time, and they were coming they're in the huddle or coming out of it, and he kicked his son. This became like a well-known thing. Like, he kicked him in the shins and got really upset, and then it was in the whole, you could hear people kind of gasping in the crowd right behind there. And it was like a headline for a day. And I even shared in the story that after the game, like, Bob Knight's like former wife was over, like, crying on the shoulder of my coach, like, because she was so upset about what had happened, and this was written up in the newspaper the next day. But really, it kind of went away then, and he went back on to, you know, doing his thing, and it was what it was. Now, that would not happen anymore today. Like, if that happened, this other thing that we did not have 25 or 30 years ago, which we maybe didn't have 10 years ago, which is like everybody would have, you know, that would have been videoed by a bunch of different people. We would have had, you know, thousands of people tweeting about it, and the kind of the social media aspect of it has really changed in a lot of ways about how, you know, in years past, some of these scandalous things or some of these things that maybe happened were very much able to be kept under wraps. You know, people could keep it quiet, and that just does not happen anymore. I shared the example, Kevin's a basketball coach. I shared the example about this basketball team we had here about 4 years ago, really, Final Four team, and some of those young men on that team became very like prominent public figures. Like they were some of the most famous people on the campus in the state during that time. And their social media following on that, you could take 5 guys on that team had a bigger social media following than the entire campus, like the UW account. And so again, that's when we talk about control, this is like unofficial control. Not saying they had control, but I'm saying their voice or what they said or what they wanted to say about something had much greater influence than maybe someone who played 30 years ago may have had. So, I think in some ways when we talk about this idea of like the NCAA, where we talk about shared governance, we talk about governance on a campus, the notion of control has really shifted, maybe not so radically formally by the nature of what the rules are, but in the way it actually lives out. That's part of this environment. It's really changed. It must make your work extra challenging. I mean, even so, I'm not saying those things aren't breaking any rule. It's like necessarily, although I know social media really complicates your work, but it makes your work just much more varied and challenging. So your answer to my next question may have nothing to do with that. I just wanted to offer my thought a little bit about some of the changes. But Katie, you've been so deep in this work. If you were things that you could change or you thought could be better in this area, I know there's probably a million things, but are there a couple things you would see as an initial starting point for change?
I think the biggest challenge for my office is always when there's an unintended consequence of a rule that negatively impacts a student athlete. And it could be because there's rules in place for competitive and recruiting equity around the types of institutional aid a student athlete can receive if they're gonna, compete on our football or basketball team, or even in the sports that have partial scholarships. And that is really hard to tell a student athlete, you have to choose. If you were recruited, you want to play for us, you might have to turn down, that institutional scholarship. And the reason the rule's in is because there's a lack of trust amongst the institutions that such and such a school is going to develop a scholarship. I would argue if that school has wanted to do that, they're doing it anyway. And so why negatively impact, our student athletes who are getting it based on need or based on the fact that they're a 4.0 student? That is one of the hardest parts of what we deal with. Same thing with name, image, and likeness. I hesitate to bring that up, but it is tough to tell student athletes what they can and can't do in regards to name, image, and likeness. And definitely understand how that can get out of control and sort of have parameters in place. But I definitely see where there's an avenue to have some reform in that area that would benefit the student athletes, but still maintain that control. Definitely not speaking any specifics about all the different laws that are coming about, but I think that there's definitely an opportunity to improve there. And then student athletes' access to information when it comes to making a decision to turn professional. That you want them to have the ability to, contact agents and have agents. Men's basketball's had some reform in that area, which has been really good. How about expanding that to football and some other sports so that when they're making that life decision, that it's not just one-sided. They have all perspectives. Again, can see where people would take advantage of that, but that's not a reason to not allow the students to access that they're going to do it right. So that's mainly a lot of the ones around student athlete welfare, and then just what you hear about all the rules that are in there that are just not enforceable. If they don't, harm the student athlete or go contrary to student athlete welfare, then why should we worry about, staff sizes necessarily? Yes, there's financial considerations and other reasons to look at that issue, but, really just making sure that, Kevin's not coaching when he's sitting on the bench because he's a non-coaching staff member. Not to pick on Kevin, but is that really what we should be doing? If that helps the student athletes to have more assistance, then let's focus on other more important initiatives that go against our core values. And then the last one I wrote down is transfers. There's obviously a lot of, high-profile situations going on across the country in regards to transfers, and just there is definitely a need to make some sort of change. It's just time, beyond time,
Yeah.
to do that.
So I think the discussion, for those who are kind of learning the field of intercollegiate athletics, or I think often we think about, or there's this athletic director who calls the shots and runs the thing. And in a lot of ways, athletic directors are at the center of a lot of this. Like, they're absolutely critical to establishing a culture, to leading in the department. Then with the Knight Commission, we hear about like presidential control. So we obviously see huge importance of our chancellors and presidents in this. But I think for those who are new and who are learning about this field, we need to know that there's like this whole kind of broader kind of infrastructure, both nationally at a conference level and then also at a campus level, that are so critical and complicated, like multi-layered. So we all are coming kind of different places, but all part of that kind of leadership infrastructure. So it's great to hear your insights, both of you. Thank you. Thank you all for the discussion, and looking forward to the next one. We'll keep talking about leadership and athletics.